racial justice is still the most pressing social issue impacting all other issues in this country. And so we need to be in this mindset of constant innovation and experimentation, but always in service of racial justice.
Welcome to The Measure. I am your host, Leon Andrews, President and CEO of Equal Measure. At Equal Measure, we help foundations, nonprofits, and public entities advance social justice through evaluation, strategy, and communications. On The Measure, you'll hear conversations with leaders and practitioners about their social change work and how to support more equitable communities through place-based systems change by centering racial equity. We're excited to have Temi Bennett and Hanh Lee as today's guests. Temi and Hanh serve as co-CEOs of IF, a foundation for radical possibility. Temi joined the foundation in 2018, bringing years of experience as an attorney and policy expert for the Council of the District of Columbia. Hanh joined IF in 2021. She was previously executive director of the Weisberg Foundation, where she worked with philanthropic and nonprofit leaders to advance racial equity. Welcome, Temi and Hanh.
Thanks, Leon. Thanks for having us.
So great to be here. Thanks, Leon.
Well, it's great to have you. I'm looking forward to our conversation. And so I'd like to start, which I typically start with our podcast series at a personal level. It's your history, your context, your place, and how that's influenced your personal story, and particularly how it shaped the work that you do today. Temi, you want to go first?
Sure, thank you. And so for me, I am an attorney by trade living in Ward 5 in the Bloomingdale neighborhood of Northwest DC. Currently, I was raised in a Black nationalist and Pan-African community on the south side of Chicago. So I claim both DC and Chicago as home because I've spent most of my adult life here. And I identify as a cisgender woman using she, her pronouns and as a Black feminist. I am a descendant of American enslavement. My folks were enslaved in North Carolina, Arkansas, and Virginia. And so that's the lens that I bring to the work. It's very Pan-African and Black feminist lens, although I want to acknowledge like being raised in a Black nationalist community. And so for me, when I think about the work, and one of the questions we always ask ourselves is like, who are our people? And so for me, my people are Black people in America, Black people in the diaspora, and people of the global majority. And I'll pass it to my co-CEO, Hanh.
Thanks, Temi, and thanks, Leon, for this context and framing. So I also live in Ward 5 in Northeast Washington, D.C., in the Eckington neighborhood. My family immigrated to the U.S. when I was 1 year old with the fall of Saigon in 1975. So I grew up in Fredericksburg, Virginia, the first Vietnamese refugee family in Fredericksburg, Virginia. So that certainly rooted a lot of my trauma around kind of always feeling like a perpetual foreigner and not quite fitting in. Fortunately, I was raised by a caring family and a loving community and teachers and coaches and friends. And I learned a lot from them about the values of community service and having a helper mindset. And I think I started my career in the nonprofit sector more as a do-gooder, right? And having a charitable mindset. My politicization around structural racism, racialized capitalism, and gendered capitalism really happened when I started working in philanthropy in 2008. As I realized that most of the funders who I was working with did not look like me and had different backgrounds as me and others that I cared about, namely Black people and people of the global majority. So I deepened my understanding of my own personal identity, historical and structural analysis deepened, my understanding of power and anti-Blackness and their role in American society, and then really decided that I no longer wanted to kind of fit in that mold of being the wedge, as Asian Americans often are in our society, and really focused on intentionally fighting for the world that Black people and people of the global majority need, deserve, and are owed. And that's what we are all about at IF. So I'm so happy to have found a home, both like a political home, a professional home, and a very personally aligned, values aligned home at IF.
Thanks. And I want to talk and pivot and talk a little bit about it for our audience. IF is a foundation for radical possibility. It describes itself as centering the leadership and experience, expertise of Black people and people in the global majority, as both of you named in the Washington D.C. region. So, how did this deep commitment to place and community come to fruition for the work that's happening at IF? Temi, you want to answer that?
Yeah, and so we're constantly evolving and we're constantly learning and unlearning, and there have been multiple iterations of the foundation to get us to where we are today, right? And so we started as a HMO conversion in the 1990s. We are at the assets of the foundation, the HMO was sold to Humana and we became Consumer Health Foundation. And so the original grants were really focused on direct access to healthcare, right? And so that was which a lot of like HMO conversion foundations start out doing. And then under our predecessor, Dr. Yannick Redwood, who is a phenomenal leader, Black woman, writer, organizer, activist, everything, right? She shifted the portfolio from direct services to advocacy and also shifting and broadening our definition of health. We started interrogating white dominant culture as an institution, and even though, again, acknowledging we were led by a Black woman, but white dominant culture is everywhere. And so that was that 2018 staff retreat. The other thing we talked about was governance. And so, how could we get community members on our board and actually pay them a stipend to serve on our board, not just an advisory role, but they had power of their vote and they were paid for their subject matter expertise. And so we did also a series called Foundation Learning Days that we did in 2019, where we invited community members to learn about the sector, learn about philanthropy, the history of philanthropy, what does it mean to serve on a board, what is fiduciary duty, what is governance look like. Hanh was leading Weisberg Foundation at the time and participated with our Foundation Learning Days. So Hanh was a part of our community and a thought partner long before she even joined the foundation. And so then after that community centering and that community centered transformation, COVID happened, right? So this really led the transformation from a health equity and racial equity foundation to a racial justice foundation that centered Black people and people of the global majority. And so after that 2020 staff retreat, we did this new 10-year strategic plan, and we felt like we were no longer Consumer Health Foundation. And so we went through this rebrand, and one of my colleagues said, had put on a list as a list for us was Innovation Foundation with the acronym IF. And we felt like Innovation Foundation sounded very tech. And so, but we loved IF as an acronym or a name. And for us, IF just meant possibility. And so our board went back and forth around like, well, it needs to stand for something. But we really pushed around, like staff really just wanted IF. And so we reconciled and decided IF with a tagline, a foundation for radical possibility. And under the organization, we have 5 pillars of work. So we have community power pillar, which is our grant making portfolio that again is participatory. And then there's the healing justice pillar and the culture pillar, which is about our narrative change. And then for systems and institutions, we believe in dismantling and disrupting institutional and structural racism. We believe that government needs to be disrupted, and we believe that the sector needs to be disruptive. And then our 5th pillar is reparations and economic justice. And this is the first time that we had an organizational stance where we said Black people were owed reparations. And so that and our guaranteed income, which is a part of our economic justice pillar, is under that pillar.
As I think about our listening audience, there could be mixed feelings about, wow, there's so much that went into the journey that it has been on. And it seems amazing for some people, might seem overwhelming as they think about, could we, given where we sit in the philanthropic world, do something like this? I'm curious how, if you field questions like that, as people are hearing your story, hearing the journey, and how you respond to people feel like, wow, it feels like, this seems like, is this doable for them, or what it would take to be doable for them to take on something like this?
Yeah, for me, and Han jump into when I'm after I say this. So for us, it again goes back to iteration and evolution, and so we are committed to learning and unlearning together. We kept evolving. When Yannick left the foundation, she's like, I don't think this it should be a one person role, right? The work is hard, grueling, and lonely, and there it leads to burnout. And so she did a memo to our board recommending shared leadership.
I love that, Temi, and I want to underline the ongoing learning and unlearning and the very public learning and unlearning be so that we can, show other funders and others in our space that clearly none of us have figured it out, right? Racial justice is still the most pressing social issue impacting all other issues in this country, right? And so we need to be in this mindset of constant innovation and experimentation, but always in service of racial justice and our bigger vision, right? And I think some of our critique of our own sector is oftentimes we're learning for the sake of learning and or think that we can't do until we've learned, right? But if we really believe we can walk and chew gum, as Temi will say, at the same time.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you both for just sharing. And I want to lean in a little bit about the journey if it's been on, because it's a bold vision for how to think about transformation of systems, whether government, philanthropy. But for those that understand the history of philanthropy and how philanthropy existed, it's centered in a white dominant history and lens. So I wonder how if I think about IF's evolution, how do you hold those contradictions about philanthropy itself?
So we believe in truth telling at IF and truth telling about racialized and gendered capitalism, truth telling about the racial atrocities, anti-Blackness in this country that have caused historical and contemporary harms to Black people and people of the global majority. And, we also work to shift really harmful or unproductive or untrue narratives, right? And one of the narratives we believe in philanthropy that we perpetuate is the scarcity mindset. And philanthropy of all sectors, right, needs to realize and live into the abundance of assets at our disposal to be able to do what we want to do in terms of the change we're trying to advance. And some ways that we as a foundation work to disrupt the paradigm of philanthropy. Temi named the 5 pillars from our strategic framework that we advance. We can talk about the multitude of programs and initiatives we have under those pillars, but what's common across all of them is how we do the work and how we approach the work. And first and foremost is by centering Blackness and centering community, namely those living at the sharpest intersections of systems of oppression, particularly race, class, and gender identity.
Yeah, thank you for that, Han. And the other thing that if makes a very clear distinction, which was the distinction between racial equity and racial justice. And there are definitely folks in the field, as we know, that think of these as intertwined. Equity is fairness and justice, but there's a clear distinction between equity and justice that it means to you as you do the work. I'd love for you to share that lens as you think with our audience for them to understand the distinction and where you're drawing the lines.
Yeah, so when we were Consumer Health Foundation and focused on racial equity, we always talked about racial equity being both a process and an outcome. And we believe that racial justice is the same. It's both a process and an outcome. And some of the changes that we've done, like so we used to have these 5 elements to a racial equity approach. And now we added this when we shifted to racial justice, we talked about what is justice and what does that mean versus racial equity. And so one, equity is about based on needs, right? And justice is based on like healing and repairing harm. And it's also about like not necessarily, a lot of times people think equality and equity is like getting people, the barometer is white people. So getting Black people to a place where white people are, getting all the other races and addressing the gaps to get them to whiteness. And we don't think that's true. We think that there are other opportunities. We think there are other aspirations. We think there are other ways to liberation. And the 6th step that we've added, so I'll go through it's the 6 steps, our approach to racial justice, right? And the first one is history. grounding your work in history, and then disaggregated data by race and place. We believe that, yes, like, so we believe in qualitative and quantitative data. And if you're looking at data and you're disaggregating data by race and place, you'll learn where interventions will be most impactful and for who those interventions will benefit. And then we support racial equity tools and that's RIAs, racial equity impact statements, that's REAPs, racial equity action plans. Those are really just help people get to the question of who benefits from this policy decision approach, whatever it is that you're looking at, who's going to benefit and who's going to be burdened. And the rule of racial equity tools is when you see that people of the global majority will be burdened, then you shift. And then community leadership. So we believe that lived experience is subject matter expertise, and those most impacted by the issues have ideas that can for those solutions too, and they should be at the table in thought partnership with the traditional subject matter experts, right? And then the policy and systems change. Yes, programs are great. We believe in programs, yes, but we also believe that systems change happens at the policy level. So we didn't get here because of programs, we got here because of policies. And so focusing on the policy is really important for us. And then five, this additional element and approach that we added was around justice. And for us, it's righting the wrong in proportion to its harm. And so this requires, and for us, that requires the acknowledgement and repair, which can lead to the closure of real gaps and to ultimately healing. And that's the place we're trying to get to.
Thank you for laying that out. And I imagine when you do this work, there's some highs and lows. There's some days where you question, can you really get to see the transformation that we want to see at the systems level, as you were saying, Temi, not just at the program level. So I do wonder, when you find your way back to still being hopeful to keep doing the work, what keeps you going? Like, what are those things that give you hope? You wanted to go first?
As Temi talked about, our co-leadership structure is something that our board put in place because we understand how isolating the job of a sole executive director or sole CEO can be. And so I have a partner in Temi who is a thought partner, offers mutual peer support, critical feedback, all of those things. And so that relationship and that partnership keeps me going and gives me hope more than I imagined it would. We're building a board that is deeply committed to our values and to continue to deepen our historical and structural analysis as we are, right? So making sure that we continue to nurture that board for that ongoing learning and unlearning and doing as we learn, right? And constant evolution that we know we need to do. And then, at the center of all this is our community. They serve as both our incentive and our inspiration, our touchstone, our purpose for doing what we do. And so that is at the center of everything that we are about. And we are part of that community. And so just being aligned, being with thoughtful, values aligned, generous, radical, beautiful people is what, for me, keeps me going. And I think as an institution, helps us keep going and being mindful to the collective care and the fight and the joy that we need to kind of prioritize as we do all of this work together.
Yeah, and I don't want to gloss over that is hard work. A real life example is our reparations project, where we are studying the endowment of our foundation and then the endowment of 7 other foundations. We partnered with NCRP to study the wealth creation of our endowment, and that they chose 7 other foundations to study. We're the only volunteer participant, but what that means is that they're studying these other foundations without their permission. And people feel away and are upset about this project. And when white people get upset and scared, Black people get hurt. And it's helpful to have Hanh to either step in or even like debrief with and figure out like supports that I need in that moment, right? And so that gives me hope. But like one of the biggest things, I mean, it's the reason why I do the work. I do it for my ancestors. I stand on their shoulders. I was somewhere and somebody asked, well, how would you measure that? Because I was like, because I think I say like they said, like, what's your life goal? I was like, I want to have a positive impact on Black people. And I was like, well, how would you measure that? And I said, I guess when I die, like one of my ancestors just pats me on my back and says, good job. That's how I measure it. But that's what gives me hope.
Really appreciate this conversation. Thank you, Han and Temi, for joining us today on the conversation. And thanks to our listeners for tuning in and tuning into another episode of The Measure.
I'd like to leave you with a quote inspired by my conversation with Han and Temi. It comes from the writer Ijoma Olu. The beauty of anti-racism is that you don't have to pretend to be free of racism to be anti-racist. Anti-racism is the commitment to fight racism wherever you find it, including in yourself. And it's the only way forward.
Please rate and comment and subscribe to the podcast. You will also learn more about Equal Measure by visiting our website, equalmeasure.org.